Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. In the autumn of 1952, a young police officer named Takeshi Yamamoto arrived at a small house in the Naruma ward of Tokyo to investigate what neighbors described as 3 days of uninterrupted silence. The front door stood slightly ajar, swaying in the cold October wind. Inside, he found a scene that would haunt him for the remaining 43 years of his life. A woman lay at the bottom of the stairs, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, her mouth frozen open in what appeared to be a scream. In the closet beneath those stairs, he discovered a small boy, no more than 6 years old, curled into a space so tight that Yamamoto had to carefully extract him like something precious and broken. The child's eyes were open, but saw nothing. He did not speak, did not cry, did not acknowledge the officer's presence. What disturbed Yamamoto most, what he would later confide to his daughter shortly before his death in 1995, was the sound he heard as he carried the boy out of that house. It came from upstairs, from a room he had not yet entered. A low, guttural croaking, almost like someone trying to speak with a crushed windpipe. When he climbed those stairs, he found the source. A black cat, ordinary in every way except for the fact that it sat perfectly still in the center of an empty room, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The moment their eyes met, the sound stopped. The cat never moved, never blinked. Yamamoto backed out of the room, the boy still in his arms, and never returned to that house. The official report stated accidental death. The unofficial truth was something else entirely. The house in Naruma Ward had stood on that corner plot since 1938, built by a carpenter named Takeo Saiki, who had returned from Manchuria with enough money to start a modest life in Tokyo. The neighborhood remembered him as quiet, competent, unremarkable. He married a woman named Kayako Kawamata in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor turned the Pacific into a graveyard. Their wedding photograph, later found in the wreckage of the house, showed a couple who looked past the camera rather than at it, as if already seeing something in their future that could not be avoided. Takeo survived the war by pure chance, his unit recalled to defend the home islands just weeks before the Battle of Okinawa decimated the regiment he would have joined. Kayako waited for him, working in a textile factory and living with her parents in Saitama. When Takeo returned in 1946, thinner and quieter than before, they moved into the house he had built and tried to resume the life that war had interrupted. Their son Toshio was born in 1946, a small, serious child who rarely cried and seemed to observe the world with an unsettling awareness. Neighbors would later recall that the boy spent hours watching things that weren't there, his head tracking movement across empty rooms. Kayako doted on him with an intensity that bordered on obsession, perhaps trying to fill some void that the war years had carved into her. Takeo worked long hours as a general contractor, rebuilding a city that had been reduced to ash and rubble. The neighborhood saw them as a normal family, one of thousands trying to reconstruct normalcy from the fragments of a shattered nation. But normalcy was a performance, and performances require energy that trauma depletes. The house began to accumulate a reputation, though no one could quite articulate why. Delivery men reported feeling unwelcome, not threatened exactly, but observed in a way that made them rush through their tasks. Children avoided the property, crossing to the other side of the street without conscious thought, following instincts older than language. The family's isolation deepened gradually, so incrementally that it seemed natural rather than chosen. Kayako stopped attending neighborhood association meetings. Takeo's greetings became perfunctory, his eyes always distant, always calculating something. Toshio enrolled in primary school but rarely spoke to other children, spending his breaks alone in corners, sometimes making small croaking sounds that the other students found disturbing. His teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Nakamura, noted in her records that the boy seemed to be imitating something, though she could never determine what. The sound was not quite animal, not quite human, but somewhere in between, a noise that seemed to bypass the ear and register directly in the primitive parts of the brain that recognize predators. In 1951, Kayako's behavior shifted in ways that concerned even the most polite and non-intrusive neighbors. She began to be seen at odd hours, standing in her garden, long after dark, perfectly motionless, staring at nothing. Mr. Suzuki, who lived next door and worked night shifts at the postal facility, reported seeing her at 3 a.m. on multiple occasions, always in the same position, always wearing the same white nightgown that seemed to glow in the moonlight. He never approached her, never called out, because something in her posture suggested that interruption would be dangerous. During the day, she moved through the neighborhood like a ghost, her shopping trips mechanical and joyless, her face a mask of careful neutrality that occasionally slipped to reveal something underneath, something that looked like terror or rage or both. The local shopkeepers noticed that she bought the same items in the same quantities every week, as if following a script that allowed no deviation. Rice, vegetables, fish, miso, always the exact same brands, always counted out with precise amounts of money that required no change. The routine was compulsive, protective, a ritual that kept something at bay. Takeo's descent was quieter, but no less disturbing. His work became erratic, projects abandoned halfway through, clients complaining about his distraction and unreliability. He began drinking, not socially, but grimly, methodically, as if trying to achieve a specific state of numbness. The local sake shop owner, Mr. Yoshida, remembered that Takeo never spoke during these purchases, simply pointing at bottles and paying in silence. His hands shook constantly, the tremor of someone under sustained psychological pressure. He lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be collapsing inward. His eyes developed a haunted quality, constantly scanning his surroundings as if expecting attack. Colleagues reported that he sometimes stopped mid-conversation, his attention drawn to empty doorways or blank walls, his expression shifting from fear to resignation. He quit jobs without explanation, walking off construction sites in the middle of the day, leaving tools and materials behind. The money stopped coming in. Bills went unpaid. The house, once meticulously maintained, began to show signs of neglect, paint peeling, gutters clogging, the garden growing wild and tangled. The truth, as it eventually emerged through patient investigation by those few who cared to look beneath official reports, was that something had entered that house long before 1952, something that had been waiting in the walls and floors since the day Takeo first drove nails into wood. The land itself had a history that the carpenter had either not known or chosen to ignore. In the Edo period, the plot had been part of a larger estate owned by a merchant family named Shimizu. In 1843, during a period of economic collapse and social unrest, the family patriarch had murdered his wife and 3 children before taking his own life, convinced that demons had infiltrated his household and were wearing the faces of his loved ones. The bodies were discovered weeks later, decomposed beyond recognition, arranged in a circle in what would later become the exact center of the Seiki house's living room. The estate was abandoned, eventually subdivided and sold, the history forgotten or deliberately suppressed by sellers eager to move cursed property. Japanese folklore is filled with stories of jibakure, spirits bound to the location of their death by the intensity of their final emotions, unable to move on, unable to rest, forever replaying the trauma that killed them. The Shimizu deaths had created such a haunting, but it had remained dormant for over a century, waiting for the right conditions, the right combination of grief and anger and despair to awaken fully. Kayako had been the catalyst, though she did not know it at the time. In 1950, she had encountered a man at the textile factory where she still worked part-time, a visiting supervisor named Kobayashi, who had shown her a kindness that her husband no longer provided. Nothing inappropriate occurred, no affair, no impropriety, simply a conversation in which Kobayashi had asked about her life and actually listened to the answer. For Kayako, starving for human connection, for recognition as something more than a wife and mother, the encounter had been transformative. She began to write about Kobayashi in a diary, pouring into those pages all the longing and frustration that she could not express anywhere else. The entries were innocent, the fantasies of a lonely woman imagining a different life, but they were also charged with an emotional intensity that resonated with the dormant energy in the house. The land recognized that intensity, fed on it, amplified it. Kayako's feelings, which should have remained private and harmless, began to manifest in ways that defied rational explanation. Takeo, already fragile from his war experiences and the grinding disappointment of post-war life, began to sense his wife's emotional distance. He searched for evidence, found the diary, and interpreted her words through the lens of his own paranoia and inadequacy. What happened next was not spontaneous, but rather the culmination of forces both human and supernatural, building toward an inevitable conclusion. Takeo's jealousy consumed him, transforming from suspicion into certainty despite the lack of any actual betrayal. He began to watch Kayako constantly, following her to work, interrogating her about every interaction, every moment away from his sight. His questions grew more aggressive, his tone more accusatory. Kayako, terrified and confused by the intensity of his suspicion, withdrew further, which only confirmed his paranoid narrative. The house seemed to encourage this spiral, rooms growing colder, shadows lengthening in ways that natural light could not explain, sounds emerging from empty spaces, footsteps where no one walked, breathing where no one stood. Toshio absorbed this escalating tension like a sponge, his young mind unable to process or escape it, the trauma literally reshaping his psychology. He stopped speaking entirely in late 1951, communicating only through that strange croaking sound that his teacher had noted. The family doctor examined him, found no physical cause, recommended psychiatric evaluation. Takeo refused, pride and shame preventing him from admitting that his family was disintegrating. The neighbors noticed the deterioration, but did nothing, bound by cultural norms of non-interference and personal responsibility. Japan, in the early 1950s, was a nation still reeling from occupation and defeat, focused on rebuilding rather than examining the psychological wounds that permeated every household. The Saiki family's suffering was not unique, merely more visible, and visibility without context looks like weakness. Mrs. Nakamura, Toshio's teacher, filed reports expressing concern for the child's welfare, but those reports disappeared into a bureaucratic system, overwhelmed by thousands of similar cases. Social services barely existed, resources were scarce, and families were expected to handle their own problems privately. The house on the corner continued its transformation from home to prison, its walls absorbing years of fear and anger, its floors creaking with the weight of accumulated misery. The Shimizu haunting, dormant for so long, found in the Saiki family the perfect vessels for its reanimation. The rage of a man who had killed his family, thinking them demons, now echoed in Takio's jealous fury. The terror of a woman murdered by her husband found expression in Kayako's growing dread. The confusion of children killed by their father resonated with Toshio's fractured understanding of safety and love. By the summer of 1952, the house had become something other than a structure of wood and tile. People who walked past it reported sudden temperature drops, even in the humid heat of August. Animals avoided the property entirely, dogs straining at leashes to cross the street, cats refusing to enter the garden, no matter how attractive the hunting might be. The mailman delivered letters to the box at the street rather than approaching the door, a practice he could not explain even to himself. Mr. Suzuki, the night shift neighbor, stopped looking out his window after dark, disturbed by the frequency with which he saw Kayako standing motionless in her garden, her white nightgown luminous in the moonlight, her face turned toward his house with an expression he could not read, but that filled him with instinctive dread. He mentioned it once to his wife, who dismissed it as exhaustion from his schedule, but he knew what he had seen, knew that Kayako's stillness was not natural, that her gaze held something predatory and lost. The final weeks of the Seiki family's life together were marked by an escalating series of incidents that would later be documented by investigators who understood that official reports rarely contain actual truth. Takeo stopped going to work entirely, spending his days drinking and his nights pacing the house, moving from room to room as if searching for something he could never find. Kayako moved through her routines like an automaton, cooking meals that no one ate, cleaning rooms that were never used, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and then in a voice so flat and lifeless that it seemed to come from someone already dead. Toshio spent hours in the closet under the stairs, a small space that offered the illusion of safety, making his croaking sounds and talking to things that only he could see. Neighbors reported hearing arguments late at night, not the usual domestic disputes, but something more disturbing. Voices raised in accusation and denial, the sound of furniture being moved or thrown, crying that went on for hours, and then stopped with a suddenness that was more alarming than the noise itself. On October 3rd, 1952, Mr. Suzuki was awakened at approximately 2 a.m. by a sound he would later describe as similar to a heavy sack of rice being dropped on a wooden floor. It came from the Saiki house, loud enough to penetrate walls and windows, followed by a silence so complete that it seemed to have weight and presence. He lay in his bed, frozen, listening, every instinct screaming that something terrible had just occurred, but equally certain that investigating would be dangerous. He did not look out his window, did not check on his neighbors, did not call police. He pulled his blanket over his head, like a child hiding from monsters, and waited for dawn. The next morning, he saw nothing unusual from his windows, no movement in the house, no signs of disturbance. He went to work, told no one, tried to convince himself that he had dreamed the sound. That night, the same sound occurred, at almost exactly the same time, followed by the same oppressive silence. This pattern repeated for 3 nights, each occurrence precisely timed, as if something was being reenacted, a script performed over and over. Other neighbors heard it too, but did not speak of it, each assuming they were alone in their experience, each too frightened or too conditioned to non-interference to take action. On October 6th, Mrs. Tanaka, who lived across the street, noticed that the Saiki house showed no signs of life, no lights at night, no movement during the day, mail accumulating in the box, newspapers piling up at the door. She mentioned it to Mr. Suzuki, who felt a surge of guilt and dread that he could not articulate. Together, they approached another neighbor, Mr. Ito, who agreed that someone should check on the family, but insisted it should be done officially, through proper channels. Mr. Ito contacted the police, reporting his concern with careful vagueness, not mentioning the sounds or the feelings, simply stating that the Seiki family had not been seen for several days. Officer Yamamoto was dispatched to perform a welfare check, a routine task that he approached with the casual confidence of someone who has knocked on 1,000 doors and found nothing more dramatic than elderly people who had forgotten to collect their mail. He noticed the unlocked door immediately. The slight movement as wind pushed it open and then pulled it closed, a rhythm like breathing. He called out, announced his presence, received no response. The smell hit him as he stepped inside. Not the overwhelming stench of advanced decomposition, but something subtler, a wrong smell, a mixture of copper and dampness, and something sweet that made his stomach turn. The house was dark, despite the afternoon sun, shadows pooling in corners and doorways, as if light could not fully penetrate. He found Kayako at the bottom of the stairs, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had fallen or been pushed, her neck bent at an angle that confirmed death. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, her mouth frozen in that silent scream. Officer Yamamoto had seen death before, as a soldier in China and as a police officer in post-war Tokyo, but something about this body disturbed him in ways he could not immediately identify. It was the expression, he realized, not fear exactly, but recognition, as if she had seen something in the moment of her death that confirmed her worst suspicions, as if dying had been almost a relief compared to what she had been experiencing. He called for backup, then continued his search of the house, drawn by duty and a growing sense that this scene was not what it appeared to be. He found the closet under the stairs, noticed that the door was slightly ajar, opened it fully, expecting to find nothing. The boy was there, wedged into the small space, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around his legs, eyes open and unseeing. Officer Yamamoto reached for him carefully, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, trying to coax some response from the child. Toshio did not react, did not blink, did not acknowledge the officer's presence in any way. His skin was cold but not corpse cold, his breathing shallow but steady, his body stiff with a tension that seemed permanent. Yamamoto lifted him gently, noting how light he was, how fragile, and as he did, he heard the sound from upstairs, that low guttural croaking that seemed to vibrate in his chest, that made his hands shake and his heart race. He carried the boy toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to leave immediately, but duty and curiosity and perhaps something else, some compulsion that came from outside himself, made him climb those stairs to investigate the source of the sound. The upper floor was darker than the ground level, despite windows that should have let in afternoon light. The air was thick, resistant, as if the house itself did not want him there. He moved down the hallway, the croaking sound growing louder, coming from a room at the end. The door was open, the room beyond visible in fragments, tatami mats, bare walls, nothing unusual. He stepped inside and saw the cat, black and ordinary except for its absolute stillness, sitting in the exact center of the room, staring at him with yellow eyes that reflected no light. The croaking stopped the instant their gazes met, silence flooding the space so completely that Yamamoto could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, magnified and somehow external. The cat did not move, did not blink, simply stared with an intensity that felt malevolent and intelligent, as if it recognized him and judged him, and found him wanting. Officer Yamamoto, a rational man trained in procedure and evidence, felt terror rise in him like nausea, overwhelming and absolute, erasing thought and replacing it with pure animal instinct to flee. He backed out of the room, never breaking eye contact with the cat, descended the stairs as quickly as he could while still carrying the boy, and exited the house just as other officers arrived. He told them about Kayako's body, directed them to the closet where he had found Toshio, but said nothing about the cat or the sound or the feeling that had consumed him in that upstairs room. The other officers entered the house, conducted their search, found what Yamamoto had described, and nothing more. The upstairs room was empty. No cat, no evidence that anything had been there. They found Takeo in the attic, hanging from a beam, dead for what the coroner would estimate as 3 to 4 days. His body showed signs of prolonged distress, weight loss, dehydration, self-inflicted wounds on his arms and chest, shallow cuts that formed no pattern but suggested sustained psychological breakdown. Near his body they found Kayako's diary, open to pages that detailed her innocent fascination with Kobayashi, words that Takeo had misinterpreted as evidence of betrayal. They found empty sake bottles, dozens of them, and a knife with blood on the blade that matched the wounds on Takeo's body. The official conclusion was straightforward: a tragedy driven by jealousy and mental illness, a man who had killed his wife and then himself, leaving their son traumatized but alive. The case was closed within a week, the bodies cremated, the boy placed in institutional care where he would remain, catatonic and unresponsive, for the next 47 years until his death in 1999. But Officer Yamamoto knew that the official story was incomplete, a comfortable lie that allowed everyone to move forward without confronting something that defied rational explanation. He returned to the house once more, 3 days after his initial visit, drawn by a compulsion he did not understand and could not resist. The front door was locked now, sealed by police tape, but he had access and authority and a need to confirm what he suspected. The house was different in daylight, less oppressive, almost ordinary, yet still wrong in ways that his senses registered, but his mind struggled to articulate. He climbed the stairs to the upper floor, moved down the hallway to that room, opened the door, and stepped inside. The space was empty, exactly as the other officers had reported. Nothing unusual, nothing disturbing. He stood in the center, where the cat had been, and waited, listening, feeling. The temperature dropped gradually, so slowly that he almost did not notice, his breath becoming visible in air that had been warm moments before. He heard the croaking sound again, distant at first, then closer, then seeming to come from inside his own head, vibrating in his skull, in his chest, in his bones. He spun around, searching for the source, and saw her standing in the doorway, Kayako, her neck still bent at that impossible angle, her mouth still open in that silent scream, her eyes fixed on him with an expression that combined accusation and hunger and an endless, bottomless rage. Officer Yamamoto did not remember leaving the house, did not remember the drive back to the station, came to awareness sitting at his desk with no clear recollection of how he had gotten there. He wrote nothing in his report about this second visit, told no one what he had seen, tried to convince himself that stress and exhaustion had created a hallucination, that grief and trauma had made him vulnerable to suggestion and imagination. But he knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and evidence, that what he had witnessed was real, that Kayako Sayaki had not moved on, that her death had bound her to that house in ways that made her more dangerous dead than she had ever been alive. He requested a transfer to a different ward, a request that was granted without question, and he never spoke of the Saiki case again except once, to his daughter, in the final weeks of his life, when cancer had stripped away his defenses and his need to protect others from knowledge that would only harm them. The house stood empty for 6 months, the property in legal limbo as distant relatives disputed inheritance and creditors attempted to recover debts. The neighborhood hoped it would be demolished. The land cleared, the memory erased, but demolition costs money, and the relatives were unwilling to invest in property that had negative value. Instead, they found a buyer, a young couple named Kitano, who were searching for affordable housing in Tokyo's competitive market, and were willing to overlook the house's history in exchange for a price well below market rate. The Kitadas moved in during April of 1953, full of optimism and plans for renovation, determined to transform the space into a home that reflected their own dreams rather than someone else's tragedy. They lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks that began with minor disturbances and escalated into a nightmare that would end with Mrs. Kitano in a psychiatric hospital and Mr. Kitano fleeing Tokyo entirely, abandoning his job, his friends, his entire life in a desperate attempt to escape something that had no physical form but could pursue him through memory and dreams. The disturbances began immediately but were easily dismissed at first. The house settling, old pipes making noise, the wind creating drafts and moving objects in ways that seemed almost deliberate but could be explained by natural causes. Mrs. Kitano, a practical woman trained as a nurse, laughed off her husband's concerns when he mentioned feeling watched, feeling unwelcome, feeling as if the house resented their presence. She attributed his unease to knowledge of the previous tragedy, a psychological response to living in a space where violent death had occurred, something that would fade as they created new memories and associations. But she could not explain the cold spots that appeared in specific locations regardless of weather or heating. The corner of the living room where the temperature dropped 15 degrees, the section of hallway where breath became visible even in summer, the closet under the stairs where frost formed on the walls, despite the humid Tokyo climate. She could not explain why their cat, a friendly animal they had owned, for 3 years, refused to enter certain rooms, would sit in doorways and hiss at empty air, would wake them at night with yowling that sounded almost human, almost like words in a language that predated speech. Mr. Kitano began having dreams, the same dream every night with slight variations, a dream in which he walked through the house and found rooms that should not exist, corridors that led to impossible spaces, doors that opened onto scenes from the past. He would see Kayako standing motionless in her white nightgown, her neck bent, her mouth open, her eyes tracking him as he moved. He would see Toshio crouched in corners, making that croaking sound, his small body twisted into positions that human joints could not achieve. He would see Takeo hanging in the attic, but in the dreams Takeo was still alive, swaying gently, his eyes open, watching, waiting for something. Mr. Kitano would wake from these dreams, soaked in sweat, his heart racing, his wife shaking him and asking what was wrong, and he would lie, would say it was nothing, just stress from work, just adjustment to the new house, knowing even as he spoke that his words were inadequate and false. The dreams grew more intense, more detailed, more difficult to distinguish from waking reality. He began to see things during the day, flickers of movement in peripheral vision, shadows that moved against the light, figures that vanished when he looked directly at them. Mrs. Kitano maintained her skepticism longer, anchored by her medical training and rational worldview, but eventually even she could not deny that something was fundamentally wrong with the house. She began to hear sounds at night, footsteps on the stairs when her husband was asleep beside her, the sound of that heavy object being dropped on the floor, the sound that missed her. Suzuki had heard back in October, occurring now with regular frequency, always at 2 in the morning, always followed by that oppressive silence. She would lie awake, listening, too frightened to investigate, too proud to admit her fear to her husband, who was clearly struggling with his own. She noticed changes in her own behavior, compulsions that seemed to come from outside herself, an urge to stand in the garden at night, to stare at nothing, to remain motionless for hours. She would find herself in rooms with no memory of walking there, would lose time in ways that suggested dissociation or fugue states, would discover bruises on her body that she could not explain, marks that looked like fingers pressed into flesh with tremendous force. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in early May, 5 weeks after they had moved in, a night that began normally and descended into chaos. The Kitadas had gone to bed early, both exhausted from sleepless nights and the psychological strain of living in constant unease. Mrs. Kitada woke sometime after midnight, pulled from sleep by a sound she could not immediately identify, a low continuous noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She sat up, found her husband still sleeping, listened carefully, trying to locate the source. It was coming from downstairs, from the living room, a sound like someone breathing but amplified, echoing through the house as if the walls themselves were expanding and contracting with respiratory rhythm. She shook her husband awake, whispered that something was wrong, that they needed to check. Mr. Kitada, still half asleep, disoriented and frightened, followed his wife down the stairs, both of them moving cautiously, aware that they were being foolish, that investigating strange noises in a haunted house was exactly what people died doing in ghost stories, but unable to stop themselves, compelled by something stronger than common sense. The living room was dark, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through curtains, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move independently of any breeze. The breathing sound was louder here, definitely coming from the corner where the temperature always dropped, the corner that their cat refused to approach. Mr. Kitada reached for the light switch, his hand shaking, his breath coming fast and shallow. The lights flickered on, revealing the room exactly as they had left it, furniture in place, nothing disturbed, nothing unusual. The breathing sound stopped instantly, cut off as if someone had closed a door, leaving silence that felt hostile and expectant. Mrs. Kitada moved toward the corner, drawn by a compulsion she would later be unable to explain, her nursing instincts overriding her fear, interpreting the breathing as a sign that someone needed help, that someone was injured or in distress. She knelt in the corner, reached out to touch the wall, and felt it pulse under her hand, felt it move as if alive, as if the house itself was breathing. She jerked back, stumbled, fell, and as she fell, she saw the shadow detach from the wall, saw it take form, saw Kayako standing above her, neck bent, mouth open, eyes filled with a rage so pure and intense that it felt like physical pressure, like weight pressing down, crushing the air from lungs, stopping the heart. Mr. Kitada saw his wife collapse, saw her eyes roll back, saw her body begin to convulse, and he ran to her, knelt beside her, tried to help, but something grabbed him, something cold and impossibly strong. Fingers wrapping around his throat from behind, squeezing with mechanical precision, cutting off air and blood flow. He struggled, tried to break free, felt consciousness beginning to fade, and in that moment of oxygen deprivation and terror, he understood with perfect clarity that the house was not haunted by Kayako Saeki, that Kayako was not a ghost in any traditional sense, that what inhabited this space was something older and more malevolent, something that had used the Saeki family's tragedy as a doorway, that fed on fear and rage and despair, that would continue to feed on anyone foolish enough to enter its domain. The pressure on his throat released suddenly, dropping him to the floor beside his wife, both of them gasping and crying. And above them, visible now in the harsh electric light, stood Kayako, her form flickering, unstable, as if existing in multiple states simultaneously. She opened her mouth wider, impossibly wide, and from that opening came not a scream but that croaking sound, that inhuman noise that Toshio had made, and with the sound came a wave of cold, so intense that frost formed on their skin, on their clothes, on the walls and floor around them. They ran, abandoning everything, fleeing the house in their nightclothes, not stopping until they reached a neighbor's door where they collapsed and begged for help. The police were called. An ambulance arrived. Mrs. Kitano was sedated and hospitalized, diagnosed with acute psychotic episode brought on by stress and carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating, a diagnosis that explained her hallucinations and collapse, but ignored the frost burns on her skin that had no medical explanation. Mr. Kitano refused hospitalization, refused to stay in Tokyo, refused to ever speak in detail about what had occurred in that house. He left the city within days, moved to Osaka, changed his name, severed all connections to his previous life. The house was abandoned again, the Kitada's belongings left inside, unclaimed, unwanted, tainted by association with something that defied rational explanation. The pattern established itself over the following years, a cycle of occupation and abandonment that would repeat with slight variations. The property was sold again in 1954 to a family named Murakami, who lasted 3 months before the father suffered a complete nervous breakdown and had to be institutionalized. Sold again in 1955 to a retired couple named Ono, who both died within 6 weeks, officially from heart failure. Though the coroner noted anomalies in their autopsies, tissue damage, consistent with extreme hypothermia, despite having died in summer, expressions on their faces that suggested their final moments had been filled with terror. Sold again in 1956, 1958, 1960, each time to buyers attracted by the impossibly low price, each time ending in tragedy, death, madness, or desperate flight. The neighborhood watched this cycle with growing alarm and resignation, understanding that the house was beyond help, beyond blessing, beyond any remedy that religion or science could provide. Local priests refused to perform purification rituals after the third request, claiming that the house was too far gone, that the curse had taken root too deeply, that attempting to cleanse it would only endanger those foolish enough to try. By 1965, the house had gained a reputation that made it effectively unsellable, its history too well documented, too consistent in its pattern of destruction. It stood empty for years, slowly deteriorating, windows breaking, roof tiles falling, walls staining with moisture and mold. The neighborhood children dared each other to approach it, to touch the gate, to look through the windows, but no one was brave or foolish enough to enter. Stories proliferated, exaggerated, and embellished with each telling, but the core truth remained constant. The house was dangerous, the house was hungry, the house wanted to be occupied so it could feed on the living. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators attempted to document the phenomena, some with cameras and recording equipment, some with religious protection and cleansing rituals. Most fled within hours, their equipment malfunctioning, their courage evaporating in the face of something that defied documentation, that existed just outside the range of cameras and sensors, that manifested primarily through feeling and dread, rather than visible phenomena. A few investigators lasted longer, driven by academic curiosity, or spiritual conviction, or simple stubbornness. and their accounts, recorded in journals and interviews before most of them died or disappeared, provide the most detailed documentation of what the house had become. Dr. Sato Hiroshi, a psychologist specializing in trauma and dissociation, spent 3 nights in the house in 1972, attempting to document the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to reportedly haunted locations. His recordings, recovered after his suicide 2 weeks later, describe progressive deterioration of rational thought, increasing paranoia, hallucinations that felt more real than consensus reality, and ultimately a complete breakdown of the boundary between self and environment. He reported seeing Kayako repeatedly, each appearance slightly different, as if she was learning, evolving, becoming more effective at manifesting terror. He reported that the house itself seemed to be alive, aware, intelligent, in a way that preceded and transcended human consciousness, a form of awareness that experienced time differently, that existed in multiple moments simultaneously, that was simultaneously Kayako and Takeo and Toshio and the Shimizu family and something much older, something that had been waiting in that land since long before humans built houses on it. Dr. Sato's final recording, made the night before he checked himself into a hotel and hung himself in the bathroom, describes an encounter that stripped away his professional detachment and left him convinced that death was preferable to the alternative. He had been in the upstairs room, the room where Officer Yamamoto had seen the cat, attempting to document temperature fluctuations with scientific instruments. The equipment failed simultaneously, all of it, batteries draining instantly despite being freshly charged, a phenomenon he noted with clinical interest even as his own fear began to overwhelm his curiosity. The croaking sound began, that noise that seemed to bypass ears and resonate directly in bone and tissue, and with the sound came Kayako, manifesting not as a visual apparition, but as a presence, a weight, a certainty that he was no longer alone, and that whatever shared the space with him meant him harm. Dr. Sato described being unable to move, paralyzed not by fear, but by something external, something that held him in place with invisible force while Kayako, or the thing wearing Kayako's form, approached. He described her face, her expression, the way her eyes held not just rage but hunger, a need so profound and consuming that it reduced everything else to irrelevance. He described how she reached for him, her hands passing through his body, without physical contact but leaving marks nonetheless. Marks on his soul, he said. Marks that would never heal. Marks that would pull him toward death with inexorable gravity. He described understanding, in that moment of contact, what the curse truly was. Not a haunting, in any traditional sense, but a kind of infection. A spiritual contagion that transferred from the house to anyone who entered, that burrowed into consciousness and could not be removed, that would drive its victims toward the same rage and despair that had created it, completing a cycle that fed the curse and allowed it to grow stronger. He described feeling himself changing, his thoughts darkening, his emotions intensifying in destructive directions, his sense of self fragmenting and reforming around a core of anger that was not his own, but that he could no longer distinguish from his authentic feelings. Dr. Sato's colleagues, reviewing his recordings after his death, noted the progressive deterioration of his speech patterns, the way his carefully academic language gave way to something more primal, more poetic, more disparate. His final words, barely audible on the tape, were a warning to anyone who might listen. Stay away. Stay away. The house is not haunted. The house is a mouth. The house is feeding. The house is becoming. The recordings were sealed, classified as evidence in a suicide investigation, and then quietly lost in the bureaucratic machinery of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, surfacing only decades later when a researcher investigating patterns of suicide in the Narima ward noticed the connection and began to assemble a more complete picture of the house's history. That researcher, a woman named Nakamura Yuki, would become one of the few people to investigate the curse and survive, though her survival came at tremendous cost and required measures that most people would consider extreme. Nakamura approached the investigation with a combination of academic rigor and spiritual preparation, understanding from her research that the curse operated on multiple levels simultaneously: psychological and supernatural, personal and environmental, targeting both individual consciousness and collective belief. She spent months studying Japanese folklore, consulting with priests and mediums, learning protective rituals and purification techniques, building a framework for understanding that incorporated both scientific skepticism and openness to phenomena that science could not yet explain. She entered the house in 1989, accompanied by a Shinto priest named Tanaka, who had agreed to provide spiritual protection despite his own reservations about the wisdom of such an investigation. They brought recording equipment, temperature sensors, cameras with infrared capability, and a detailed protocol for documenting anything unusual while maintaining their own psychological stability. The house had deteriorated significantly by 1989, nearly 40 years of abandonment, leaving it structurally unsound. Roof partially collapsed, floors rotting, walls stained with decades of water damage and mold. Yet despite this physical decay, or perhaps because of it, the sense of malevolent presence was stronger than ever, as if the house's physical dissolution had allowed something else to become more manifest, less constrained by material reality. Nakamura and Tanaka entered cautiously, the priest performing preliminary purification rituals at the threshold, prayers and salt and sacred symbols meant to establish boundaries between the living and whatever existed in that space. The rituals had no apparent effect, the house accepting their presence with what felt like amusement, like a predator allowing prey to believe it had a chance of escape. They moved through the ground floor first, cameras recording, sensors detecting the expected temperature anomalies and electromagnetic fluctuations that characterized reportedly haunted locations. Nakamura maintained her professional composure, documenting everything, speaking her observations into a handheld recorder, describing the physical space and her emotional responses with equal attention. She noted the way certain areas felt heavier, denser, as if space itself was compressed or folded. She noted visual distortions in her peripheral vision, shapes that suggested human form but vanished when viewed directly. She noted the smell, not decay exactly, but something older, something that reminded her of deep caves and ancient forests, places where human presence was temporary and unwelcome. Tanaka grew increasingly agitated, his prayers becoming more urgent, his movements more defensive, as if he sensed something approaching that his rituals could not deter. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step producing sounds that seemed too loud, too resonant, echoing in ways that the physical space could not explain. The upstairs hallway stretched before them, darker than it should be despite their flashlights, the far end receding into shadow that light could not penetrate. Nakamura felt the first real surge of fear, a visceral response that bypassed her rational defenses and connected to something primal, something that recognized danger at a level deeper than conscious thought. She forced herself forward, Tanaka following reluctantly, both of them moving toward the room at the end of the hall, the room where Officer Yamamoto had seen the cat, where Dr. Sato had encountered Kayako, where multiple witnesses had reported the most intense manifestations. The door was closed, though Nakamura could not remember seeing anyone close it, could not remember it being closed when they had looked up from the ground floor. She reached for the handle, hesitated, felt Tanaka's hand on her shoulder, warning her, pleading with her to reconsider. She opened the door, and the room beyond was not empty, not dark, not what she had expected based on descriptions and photographs. The space was illuminated by a light that had no visible source, a cold blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The temperature plummeted instantly, their breath becoming clouds of vapor, frost forming on every surface, including their skin and clothes. And in the center of the room stood Kayako, not flickering or translucent, but solid, present, real, in a way that transcended hallucination or projection. Her neck was bent at that impossible angle, her white nightgown stained with old blood, her mouth open in a scream that produced no sound, but that Nakamura could feel in her chest, a vibration that disrupted heartbeat and breathing. Kayako's eyes fixed on them, and Nakamura understood in that moment that this was not a recording, not a residual haunting, not an echo of past events, but something conscious, something aware, something that recognized them as individuals and had been waiting for them specifically. Tanaka began his most powerful banishing ritual, voice rising in prayer and command, gestures precise and forceful, calling on deities and ancestral spirits to cleanse this space and cast out the entity that dwelled within. The light in the room intensified, the temperature dropped further, and Kayako moved, not walking but gliding, her feet never touching the floor, closing the distance between herself and the priest with terrible speed. Tanaka's prayers faltered, his voice breaking, his hands shaking as he tried to maintain the ritual, but Kayako passed through his protective barriers as if they did not exist, reached him, placed her hand on his chest, and Nakamura watched as the priest's face went slack, as his eyes rolled back, as he collapsed without sound or struggle. Kayako turned her attention to Nakamura, approached with that same gliding motion, and Nakamura found herself unable to move, unable to flee, unable to do anything but stand and wait for contact that she knew would destroy her. But in that moment of paralysis and terror, Nakamura experienced something that would later allow her to survive and understand, a moment of clarity that cut through fear and revealed the true nature of what she faced. She saw not just Kayako, but through Kayako, saw the layers of rage and pain and despair that had accumulated in this space over more than a century, saw the Shimizu murders and the Saiki tragedy and the countless smaller griefs and angers that the house had absorbed, saw that the curse was not created by any single event, but was rather the result of accumulated suffering that had reached a critical mass, that had achieved a kind of consciousness, that had learned to perpetuate itself by creating more suffering, more rage, more despair. She saw that Kayako was both victim and instrument, trapped by the intensity of her own final emotions, but also used by something larger, something that existed in the intersection of place and trauma, something that fed on the living, not out of malice, but out of hunger, out of an endless need to fill a void that could never be filled. Nakamura spoke, not prayers or commands, but simple acknowledgement, speaking directly to Kayako, to the woman who had died in fear and rage, who had been consumed by forces she never understood, who had become the face of a curse that predated and transcended her individual suffering. She spoke about Kobayashi, about the innocence of Kayako's feelings, about the tragedy of being murdered for emotions that were never acted upon, about the injustice of being bound forever to the site of her death, while her murderer had escaped through suicide. She spoke with compassion and understanding, acknowledging the validity of Kayako's rage while also recognizing that the rage had been weaponized by something else, had been transformed into an engine of destruction that served purposes Kayako never intended. And as she spoke, something shifted in the room, the temperature rising slightly, the oppressive weight lifting fractionally. Kayako's expression changing from pure rage to something more complex, something that included confusion and grief, and a terrible, aching loneliness. The moment passed quickly, Kayako's form destabilizing, flickering, the rage reasserting itself as whatever controlled the curse recognized and responded to the threat of compassion, of understanding, of anything that might weaken its hold. Kayako lunged forward, her hand passing through Nakamura's chest, and the researcher felt the same mark that Dr. Sato had described, a wound that existed on a level deeper than flesh, an infection of the spirit that would pull her toward darkness and despair and eventual self-destruction. But Nakamura had prepared for this possibility, had spent months studying not just the curse but the psychology of trauma and infection, had developed a framework for understanding how spiritual contamination spread and how it might be resisted. She knew that she was marked, that the curse had touched her, that she would spend the rest of her life fighting its influence. But she also knew that she had learned something crucial, that she had glimpsed a potential weakness in the curse's structure, a possibility that compassion and understanding might interrupt the cycle of rage and suffering that sustained it. Nakamura fled the room, dragged the unconscious Tanaka down the stairs and out of the house, called for medical assistance from a neighbor's phone. Tanaka survived, but never fully recovered, spending the remaining years of his life in and out of psychiatric facilities, tormented by dreams and visions that medicine could not alleviate. Nakamura dedicated herself to researching protective techniques, ways to resist the curse's influence, methods for helping others who had been touched by similar spiritual contamination. She published papers under pseudonyms, shared information through underground networks, became a quiet expert consulted by people who had encountered things that official institutions refused to acknowledge. She lived with constant vigilance, monitoring her own thoughts and emotions for signs of the curse's influence, using meditation and ritual and psychological discipline to maintain boundaries between herself and the darkness that tried to consume her. The house was finally demolished in 1994, not out of any belief that destroying the physical structure would end the curse, but simply because it had become too dangerous structurally, too likely to collapse and injure the curious or desperate who continued to enter despite all warnings. The demolition crew reported difficulties from the beginning, equipment malfunctioning, workers suffering injuries, and psychological distress, the project taking 3 times longer than estimated. When the house was finally reduced to rubble, the debris was handled carefully, transported to a remote landfill, buried deep under layers of earth and concrete. The land was cleared, blessed by multiple priests from different traditions, and then left empty, a vacant lot in the middle of Tokyo's urban sprawl, too contaminated by history and reputation to be developed, too valuable to be left idle permanently. It remains empty to this day, a gap in the city's dense fabric, avoided by those who know its history, ignored by those who do not. But the curse did not end with the house's destruction, could not end, because the curse was never really about the physical structure, but about the suffering that had accumulated in that place, about the rage and despair that had achieved consciousness and learned to reproduce itself through contact with the living. Those who had been touched by the curse carried it with them, spreading it through proximity and interaction, creating new centers of infection that manifested in different ways, but followed the same essential pattern: rage breeding rage, suffering breeding suffering, the cycle perpetuating itself across time and space. Toshio Saiki, who had survived the original tragedy, died in institutional care in 1999. His death officially attributed to pneumonia, but occurring on the anniversary of his mother's murder, in a room where staff reported hearing that distinctive croaking sound for weeks afterward. Officer Yamamoto's daughter, who had heard her father's final confession about what he witnessed in the Seiki house, took her own life in 2001, leaving a note that described being haunted by a woman with a broken neck who appeared in mirrors and reflections. The Kitadas' cat, which had fled the house with them in 1953, lived for 22 years, an impossible lifespan for a cat, and was reported by neighbors to make sounds at night that resembled human speech, sounds that drove nearby residents to move away. The curse adapted, evolved, learned from each encounter, each victim adding their experience to its collective consciousness, making it more sophisticated, more effective, more difficult to resist or escape. Researchers who investigated the Seiki case, journalists who wrote about it, filmmakers who adapted it into fiction, all reported experiencing unusual phenomena afterward, dreams and coincidences, and moments of inexplicable dread that suggested they had attracted the curse's attention. The adaptation that brought the Grudge story to international prominence in the early 2000s, both Japanese and American versions, sparked a new wave of interest and investigation, and with that interest came new infections, new victims who sought out the original location, who visited the empty lot where the house had stood, who brought pieces of debris home as morbid souvenirs, not understanding that they were carrying spiritual contagion that would take root in their own lives and spaces. Nakamura Yuki, now in her 70s, continues her work, documenting cases, advising victims, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for resistance and containment. She has identified a network of curses across Japan, locations and families marked by similar patterns of accumulated suffering transformed into infectious rage, each curse unique in its details, but sharing common characteristics, common vulnerabilities. She teaches that the key to surviving spiritual infection is not denial or faith or ritual alone, but rather a combination of all three, plus constant vigilance, plus an understanding that the curse feeds on isolation and shame, that bringing it into light, speaking about it openly, acknowledging its reality without giving it power through fear, these actions weaken its hold. She teaches that compassion is a weapon against curses born from rage, that understanding is armor against infection born from misunderstanding, that community is protection against the isolation that allows contamination to spread unchecked. But she also teaches that some curses are too strong, too deeply rooted, too well fed by accumulated suffering to be fully defeated, that the best one can hope for is containment, resistance, survival rather than victory. The Grudge curse, the original infection that began with the Shimizu murders and achieved full manifestation with the Seiki tragedy, remains active, remains hungry, remains patient. The empty lot in Naruma Ward, where the house once stood, is monitored by volunteers who understand what it represents, who watch for signs of new manifestation, who intervene when possible to prevent new victims from making contact. But they cannot be everywhere, cannot prevent every encounter, cannot stop the curse from spreading through digital media, through images and recordings, through the very act of telling the story, which creates connections that the curse can follow. There are reports, unconfirmed but persistent, that a new house is being planned for the lot, that developers have finally decided the location is too valuable to leave empty, that modern construction and careful design can overcome any historical contamination. Nakamura has protested, has warned everyone who will listen, has provided documentation of the curse's history and nature, but her warnings are dismissed as superstition, as the ravings of someone too immersed in darkness to see clearly. The construction is scheduled to begin in 2026, exactly 74 years after the events that created the most powerful manifestation of the curse, 74 being a number with deep significance in Japanese numerology, a number that suggests completion and return, a number that marks the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Those who understand these things are preparing, gathering resources and knowledge, recruiting helpers who might be able to intervene when the inevitable occurs, when the new house becomes another feeding ground for the curse that cannot die. The story of the Grudge, the real story beneath the fiction and adaptation, is not a story about ghosts or monsters or supernatural evil, but rather a story about how suffering accumulates and transforms, how rage and despair can achieve a kind of consciousness, how trauma spreads through contact and proximity, how places remember what happens within them, and how that memory can become active, aggressive, hungry. It is a story about the cost of ignoring pain, of dismissing grief as weakness, of isolating the traumatized rather than helping them heal. It is a story about how violence echoes across time, each act of cruelty creating ripples that touch countless lives, each moment of rage feeding a cycle that grows stronger with each repetition. And it is a story with no clear ending, because the curse continues, because the suffering that created it has never been fully acknowledged or addressed, because as long as people experience the kind of rage and despair that Kayako felt, that Takeo felt, that the Shimizu patriarch felt, the curse has fuel, has purpose, has reason to continue existing. Those who study such things speak of the Grudge as if it were alive, a predator that hunts through human consciousness, that uses our fears and angers as doorways into our lives. They speak of it with respect, with caution, with the understanding that acknowledging its existence gives it power, but ignoring its existence provides no protection. They teach that the only defense is awareness combined with compassion, understanding combined with boundaries, knowledge combined with humility. They warn that seeking out the curse, testing it, trying to prove oneself brave, or resistant, or special, these actions are forms of suicide, invitations for infection that the curse will gladly accept. They advise distance, both physical and psychological, avoiding places where the curse is known to manifest, refusing to engage with images or stories that might create connections, protecting oneself through knowledge, but also through knowing when not to seek knowledge. The empty lot in Nerima Ward stands as a monument to suffering unresolved, to rage that achieved immortality, to the terrible truth that some wounds never heal and some victims never rest. The neighborhood has learned to live with it, to walk past it without looking too closely, to warn newcomers without explaining too much, to maintain a collective silence that is part respect and part self-protection. The children no longer dare each other to approach, the stories having lost their appeal as entertainment and become instead warnings, cautionary tales about the cost of curiosity and the danger of places that should be left alone. The lot remains empty, will likely remain empty regardless of what developers plan, because some ground is too poisoned for building, too saturated with memory and suffering to ever support new life. And somewhere in that emptiness, in the space between what was and what might be, Kayako waits, not as she was in life, but as she became in death, transformed by rage and pain into something that transcends individual identity, something that is simultaneously her and not her, victim and predator, ghost and living curse. She waits with the patience of something that exists outside normal time, that experiences past and present and future as a single continuous moment, that knows that eventually someone will forget the warnings, will dismiss the history, will build on that ground or enter that space or make contact through curiosity or compassion or simple bad luck. And when that contact occurs, the cycle will begin again. The curse will feed again. The story will continue because the story has no end. Only pauses between manifestations, only gaps between victims. Only the illusion of resolution that time and distance provide until the next encounter reminds everyone that some things cannot be escaped, cannot be defeated, can only be survived through knowledge and vigilance and the slim hope that awareness provides protection even when protection seems impossible. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.